Thank you so much, Chair. And through you, I would like to thank all of our witnesses today and, of course, thank them so very much for their testimony. I'm going to start with Mr. Lopresti as well. I'm really fascinated by a lot of your testimony today, and I think was very pleased with some of the language, like watching and observing the play as a way of actually having informed consent about serving. I think that is something really profound. And the therapeutic reenactment. I know in a lot of my studies that really can make a difference for people. So thank you for using some of that language. I think that's really important. So in the work that I have been able to do with multiple veterans in my role, one of the things that I have seen again and again, I'm not interested in blaming or shaming. I'm not going to blame either level or any past government. I think it's something that's wrong in our society, but what I don't see in the VAC workers is really strong trauma-informed training, so that when they're addressing the issues, they don't always have the correct way of managing these really big things. And I think one of the things we all agree with is that the veterans who come back again and again are the veterans who have the biggest struggles. So making sure that they're supported in a way that is trauma informed is really important. And we've heard again testimony today from one of our witnesses, thank you, Mr. Menke, about having to change over of caseworkers, not having people that follow you through the process, so that you're having to retell, which can be very challenging. So, and we know that they're also at VAC hiring people on short-term contracts, which means the turnover is really high. And this is a particular group of people where we don't think we want to see this. So based on the play that you did and the research that you have done, can you talk to us a little bit about your thoughts around how important it is to have the service providers on the other side, regardless of role? I think that's also really important, is if you don't have everyone trained in how to provide trauma-informed care, things fall apart eventually. So I'm just wondering if you could talk about that, and if you saw anything or did anything in your studies that particularly talk about how important that is, and of course, how important that is during the transition period.
Through the chair, thank you for your question, ma'am, and thank you so much for putting it in the context of the research. It helps me answer the question. So one thing that was interesting about going through the performance as many times as we did is that even with someone as experienced as Dr. Marvin Westwood, who has been working with veterans for a long time, we were still constantly learning. Just like some of the other witnesses mentioned, there's different generations of veterans and different needs, and even their learning abilities, how we're taught in school to learn, interpret, share 50 years ago is different than 10 years ago today. And so what we noticed when audience members would come up and we'd have conversations with other practitioners in the field is that they were constantly having to adapt and change to the group. And so it's difficult, really challenging to have a one course, per se, where all people working with veterans would take this course and that would certify you trauma informed, because it's changing how trauma is perceived and how people manage it and work with it. So what I think I personally witnessed in the play was the importance of immersing yourself in the community. You can't do it every day or all day, but at different parts, immersing yourself in the community, having a sense of what's happening today with the population you're serving, and then informing your practice based on what trends you're seeing today. And you might have to do that at regular intervals to have the best approach and be trauma informed for today versus yesterday.
No, that makes sense. And I know in my office, all of my team almost have been trained by veterans around trauma-informed care, people that are very educated, and it's really made our lives a lot better, because hearing those stories is also really hard. So trying to find that balance point, I think, is important. And self-care is so important if you're trying to care for others. So I'm also really curious, you talked about hypermasculinity across gender expression. So I'd like to hear a little bit more about what that means to you. And we just are in the process of finishing up, hopefully soon, a study on women veterans. And we heard again and again that they felt extremely invisible and that their reality wasn't reflected. And in fact, the general public seems to think that if they even have medals on with civilian attire, that their medals belong to somebody else, that as a man, in some way connected to them. So I guess I'm curious about the hypermasculinity across gender expression, what that means and the impact. And then the other part that I'm curious about is in the play, did you have any stories that were women specific? And did you find it hard? Were there any challenges in getting women to speak out in relation to their service compared to men, and what that reality was on both sides?
So please let me know if I misunderstood the question. But the first part was the idea of hypermasculinity and how that impacts the veterans in transition and their service. And so, as I mentioned, one of the things we notice is that the stronger the person adopts this unrealistic idea of hypermasculinity, the more rigid their belief system comes, and the greater the barriers they create in front of themselves for accessing help. Accessing help often needs us to take an approach where we admit to ourselves, I'm injured, I need help, and I need assistance. That's an extremely brave and difficult thing to do. A lot of participants who have gone through the VTP often say it's the hardest thing that they've ever done, harder than any course, Pathfinder, or any of the service they've done, is sharing what they've gone through, because it's so vulnerable. And nowhere, they've expressed that nowhere in their training leading up to that was that something they were taught. And often not even in their education as a student in elementary school or high school, it's not necessarily a course on emotions and how we process trauma. So the adoption of that hypermasculinity in that role and how rigid you are, it's very difficult. Why that was a focus and why it's a focus for me, the lens I actually take to counseling is a feminist lens. And so what that means is that we explore social gender roles and how that shapes someone's path, both career and even accessing help. Where do they go accessing help based on the social gender norm that they adopt? So it's something very close to me and my current practice and my interest. The second part of your question, ma'am, the female participants, we did have a female participant who was a non-veteran, and she worked closely with the families as well as some female veterans to try and weave in those elements of the story. She was undergoing her doctorate of counseling psychology at the time, and she was able to provide that voice. Nowhere in our discussions following plays did we feel that the female witnesses in the room or the veterans felt any barrier in approaching us, and we didn't notice that was a barrier.